Hey guys, another video for our How to Do Stuff in Japan playlist and our mini-series on being married to a Japanese person. We like to start these by clarifying that yes, this does not always apply to everybody because of course there's lots of different individuals and people have different personalities, so it doesn't relate to everybody, but these are generalizations based on what it generally seems to be the case. These are based on our direct observations and also the observations of the people around us in Japan who have told us what they've observed. So generally these things are the case. So today we're talking about in-laws, parents-in-laws, so particularly in this case Japanese parent-in-laws. So of course a couple of things that are obvious. One is pretty well anywhere in the world, in-laws, relationships with between people and their in-laws, with mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, everybody-in-law, anywhere in the world can be difficult, can't it? It's notorious, isn't it? It's the fodder of comedians, isn't it? The mother-in-law joke. So of course it can be the case anywhere in the world. And same, of course, son-in-laws, daughter-in-laws can be problems as well. So lots of people can relate to that. So of course it's not unique to Japan. As with all our how-to videos, most of it's not unique to Japan at all. We're just talking about what's in Japan. The other thing is, of course, you can be lucky and you can get some very good in-laws. So again, never like to make this about us, but in my case, my Japanese in-laws, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and my brother-in-laws times two, great, no problem at all, no problem at all. But that's not unique. There are, of course, other in-laws who are really good as well. However, that is not always the case, and in actual fact, I feel extremely lucky because there are way more horror stories than there are good stories when it comes to this particular topic. A couple of reasons for this is, one is that in Japanese society, and we've talked about this in other videos previously, it's normal to take guidance from the people above us, and that might be our senpai, our sort of more senior friends, or our senior co-workers, or our boss, or parents, or older brother and sister even. And that's perfectly normal in Japan, and it's based on a sort of a collective thinking that if you listen to the advice of the people above you, chances are you're going to make a better decision. And there's actually a professor in the USA who did studies on this and found that it is often the case that the Western style of wanting to do things our own way and not listening to the people above us tends to result in us making more mistakes and having more problems, whereas the Japanese style of listening to the people above you tends to mean that you're getting advice based on collective knowledge, which means you tend to get a better result if you listen to the people above you. And I mean, there's a million examples of this again in every country, isn't there? How many times when you're a kid, how many times are you told something by your parents that you don't listen to, and then you end up having some catastrophe as a result? Happens, doesn't it? Happens all the time. Don't do that, you'll get hurt. Bang. So in Japanese society, Japanese life, generally it's more normal to listen to your parents and to listen to the people above you, your aunts and your uncles and your grandparents and people like that. And for Japanese people, that's more comfortable, usually. Not always the case again, but usually that's the case. So Japanese people, and you'll find this if you do have a Japanese wife or a Japanese husband, you might have your opinion on something, but if their mother or father or older brother or grandparents or older neighbor or older person at work has an opinion and it's different to yours, that your partner might listen to that other person's opinion more than they do to you on that topic. And for some people that come from other cultures and then find themselves being married to a Japanese person, that can be a problem, can't it? Because you know, you have your opinion on how you should do something in your life, maybe in your relationship or in your home, or something directly affecting you. You have your opinion on how you want to do it, but the in-laws can have a big influence on how your partner sees it. And if your partner gets stuck, and this is what we see, and this is where it can really get difficult, is is the partner, your Japanese partner, can get stuck between you and their family, and that's really tricky. So if you're saying, I want to do this and I think we should do this, and you know, their parents and their brother, and I mean, example of that would be if you decide to move back to your country, you marry a Japanese person and then you want to move back to your country, and their parents and their older brother and older sister and, you know, aunts and uncles and grandparents and everybody tell them it's a bad idea. No, you should raise, you know, if you get married, you should raise your children in Japan because it's better for them, and everybody's putting the pressure on for them to do that, and you're saying, let's go back to our country. That's massive pressure on that partner. Their whole life, usually, not always the case, but usually they've spent their whole life listening to the advice that's come from their parents and their older family members. And here you are saying you want to do something different, and their whole life they've always listened to their family, and now they're in this situation where it's natural for them to listen to their family, but you're wanting to do something else, and that's a really tricky spot. Seen that a lot. That's often, we've mentioned in previous videos on this topic about people going back to their old country and their Japanese partner not going with them, or they go back to their country with their Japanese partner and then their Japanese partner comes back to Japan, and that's obviously the end of the marriage, isn't it, when that happens? And we hear this one a lot. That does happen a lot. You know, the parents say, come back to Japan and it'll all be okay here, and you know, living with the parents, and here's a sort of an added thing as well, living 2 or 3 generations in one house, and we showed this on some previous videos. Quite often people will demolish an old house here and build a new house, and you'll have the family living upstairs, so mum, dad and the kids living upstairs and the grandparents living downstairs, and that dynamic is still really, really popular in Japan, because that means that the family can look after the grandparents, and it also means the grandparents can help look after the family, look after the kids. There's a pooling result there. Usually they have their own kitchens and bathrooms and things, but basically you're living in under the same roof, which makes living cheaper for everybody. And usually the house has been built on the family's piece of land, so obviously that makes it cheaper as well. So there's a real practicality to living like that, and Japanese people are used to that as well. So that might seem unusual to some of us and difficult for us to handle. Imagine living with your in-laws, you know, which to some people's like, you know, horrific, but quite normal in Japan. Quite still very common. We could show you a dozen examples close to here of exactly that. You'll often see in Japan, you'll see a new house and it'll have 2 front doors and 2 letterboxes, but it's just one house, and it's because 1 door and 1 letterbox is for the grandparents downstairs, and 1 door and 1 letterbox is for the family upstairs, and that's quite normal. So the complication with that can be, if you're married and you go back to your country and it's not working very well, your partner's parents can be saying, come back and live with us. Bring the kids and come back and live with us in Japan, in our house, you know, or we'll build a new house and you can live in that with us, you know, and that's a perfectly viable option for a Japanese person who's got kids, who's living in America or Australia or France or somewhere, and they're not happy in their relationship. Coming back and living in Japan like that is a very viable option. The other thing is, let's just imagine that your relationship is all going well and you are living in Japan. There is a really good chance that at some stage in the future they're going to look at this as an option, that the in-laws are going to be saying, okay, well look, we're getting on in years, we've got this big piece of land over here, how about we build a house and everybody lives together? And if your Japanese partner is keen on that idea, and your in-laws are keen on that idea, and everybody thinks it's a great idea, and you're the only one who's going, oh, I don't like that, that's going to be a really tricky situation, obviously, isn't it? So it is really tricky. Just this, again, with this being married to a Japanese person topic, you can see that I mean, the same in any country, you've got to have 2 people that can work things out together and get on and everything else, but you can see that quite often the biggest obstacle is just straight out culture itself. Is that we're coming from cultures where, you know, you get married and you move away and you have your own house and you have your own family and you do your own thing, you know, make your own decisions, whereas here that connection with family is still still really popular and still really strong. Of course, people do move away. What often happens is somebody will move away for work. You know, the family grew up in a little country city, little country town somewhere, and then, you know, one of the people gets a job in a big city or another city or somewhere else, sometimes another country, but in another city is most common for Japanese people, and then they move off to another city, so they leave the in-laws behind. That does happen, of course. I mean, this isn't always the case that the in-laws aren't always living under the same roof. Quite often, too, they can be in another city altogether, and that's not uncommon either. But we do hear that traditional style of in-laws and family living together is still very common. And not only do we hear foreigners who are married to Japanese people talking about this, going, oh, the in-laws, you know, the in-laws have given us a block of land. Actually, what we see, it's a bit of a trap. What often happens is when people first come to Japan, they first get with somebody and they get engaged and then they get married, and you'll hear them say, the in-laws have given us a block of land. And we've heard this a few times from people, and it's like you can just about hear in the background, dun dun dun, because that's never as simple as it sounds. You know, the in-laws have given us a block of land and they're going to help us get a home loan so that we can have a new house built. Bum bum bum, because it usually comes with a whole heap of complications. Sometimes it's straight out that they're going to build a 2-story house there and they're going to live downstairs. That's often the case. That's the catch that comes with that piece of land. If you're lucky, they won't, and then at least you're living on the land that they still own, and that happens as well. And then it's in Japanese it's called giri, and it's obligation, and of course we have huge obligation to in-laws anyway. You know, that's just the natural thing. And in Japanese society, the obligation to family, to parents and things is stronger than it is in a lot of other cultures right from the start. And then add into that, they've given you the block of land you're living on. Stuff like that, quite often they'll lend money or, you know, deposits or whatever, and we've heard this so many times, and it starts off all good, it's all too easy. Oh, they've given us this block of land and they've helped us get a loan and it's all good, and then 3 or 4 years later, there's one guy in particular, I'll just touch on this briefly, one guy in particular got into this situation, and then about 5 years later, or a bit longer maybe, he decided he was thinking about going back to his own country with his family, wanted to take his family back to his own country, and he got a price from the real estate agent how much he could sell the house for, and of course it had been a new house, brand new house, but the price drops, we've talked about this before, the price drops down to zero over 20 years, so over that 5 or 10 years the price had dropped, the value of the house itself had dropped, the land had stayed the same of course, and then the home loan hadn't gone down too much, of course, he hadn't paid that much off in that time, and so basically the bottom line was, if he wanted to get back living in his own country, he had to pay the bank more than what he could sell the house for to be able to get out of the situation. And of course that's pretty tricky, isn't it? You know, not only would he be walking away with nothing, but he'd be walking away with less than nothing. The result was he decided not to sell and he stayed where he was. So he's still in Japan. So that idea of going back to his own country, he had to hit that on the head, and he's still in Japan. So these complications can be really tight. And then if you don't have that, if you're just quietly living, you buy your own house and you're living in your own house and you've nothing to do financially with your in-laws at all, which is good if you can do that, that's actually probably the best way to go. But even then, you know, when they're telling your partner what they think you should do, you know, what school your kids should go to, or what job you should have, you know, what lifestyle you should be leading, some really personal stuff sometimes about how you actually want to live, you know, and they'll be going, oh, you know, no, and putting the pressure on. So, you know, it's complicated, it really is. The other thing we see here is quite often the foreigners here that get married to Japanese people tend to pick a Japanese person who can speak English. It just tends to be what happens. It doesn't always happen, didn't happen in our case, but quite often it does, that the foreigner tends to end up with someone in Japan who can speak English, and but of course usually the in-laws don't. So if the person's picked a partner who can speak English, but then of course they've got to spend time with the in-laws as well, and because the in-laws can't speak English, and that could add another level of complication and stress and drama, because basically it means that unless your Japanese skills are up to it, you know, you're not going to be able to put your case across when they're sitting around the table. And there's another horror story. Horror stories keep coming to mind, right? There's lots of them. Another horror story that keeps coming to mind is one foreign guy we know came to Japan from his country, and he married the Japanese lady in his country, and she was pregnant with a child, and they decided to come live in Japan. And they came to Japan and they moved in with her parents, and her sister was living there as well with her husband. So they had this big house with 2 families living in it and the grandparents. And this guy was so far down the pecking order because the decision-making process, you know, the grandparents were the ones who had the biggest say in what went on. And then his wife was dealing directly with them, and his English wasn't really good, so he couldn't really put a case across. He didn't even know what was happening most of the time. People would be sitting around the table, the family would be sitting around the table discussing their stuff, you know, the stuff that affected him directly, and he'd be sitting there, no idea what they're talking about, and the wife would be telling him a little bit of what was going on, but he really didn't get an idea. And then he couldn't put his point of view across, and just a shocker. Short story, he ended up living in his car. He ended up taking his stuff and putting it in his car and driving away and living in his car for a long period of time before he found somewhere else to live. But that was just a horror story, that one, where he just couldn't put across his point of view, and he was so far down the pecking order. He used to they just tell him what to do. Time to come and have dinner. Come and have dinner. And he'd come and have dinner, and they didn't ask him what he'd like to eat or anything, because in Japan they don't do that. Here's your dinner, and they just give him his dinner, and whether he liked it or not. And because you're expected to eat it, anything as an adult, only kids can be fussy about what they eat. Adults who are fussy about what they eat are considered to be children and get no respect from anybody. So they just put his dinner down in front of him and he had to eat it. And then they'd tell him when to take a bath. And because the way Japanese families take a bath, usually people go and wash themselves and then jump in the bath, like plunge in the bath, and use the same water usually. And there's an order, and most Japanese families can tell you. If you ask them, what order do you have your bath in, they'll usually tell you, dad's first, then mum, then this one, then this one, or dad's first, and then the older brother, and then the younger sister, and then the mother. You know, there's usually the family's got a system, and they just slotted him into the system. So he'd be sitting there doing something, and they'd say, right, your turn for a bath. You know, your turn for a bath, off you go. And so he went from being an independent dude living in his own country where he did what he wanted to do, and he lived in his own place and did his own thing, to living in this house like a child, basically, being told what to do by everybody. The mother-in-law, the father-in-law. The older brother has another complication as well. When we're talking about in-laws, a big power figure in most families in Japan is the oldest son, and that's still the case here. The oldest son's given a lot of weight. And this is from when they're kids too. The oldest son is treated differently. If you spend time with a family here that's got sons, you'll notice that the oldest son almost always is treated differently from the younger sons. And as they get older, they get given more and more say in what's going on, and they're given a lot of respect. And so the oldest son can really have a big influence as well. The oldest son, my brother-in-law, when I first got together with my wife before I married her, he basically wouldn't talk to her and wouldn't talk to me until we got married, because and rightfully so, he's a smart guy. He assumed that I was just going to spend some time with her and then go back to my own country, and that she'd end up brokenhearted, and the thing is that is usually the case with most relationships between Japanese people and Japanese girls and foreigners. That is often the case. Is the guy's here for a short period of time, he takes advantage of girls while here, makes all sorts of promises, and then goes home and leaves them brokenhearted. And that's more often than not the case. What percentage end up getting married? So his concerns were justified and reasonable, and his opinion about that really affected everybody. It affected us directly, and then the other members of the family all went, yeah, he's got a good point. And that was pretty tricky for a while. After we got married, he stood up at our wedding and made an amazing speech about how that's how he used to see it, but now he saw that it was a good thing and that everything was working out well, and he was happy for us. And it was the most touching speech at the wedding, actually. But again, that was lucky. because you also get in-laws who just don't like foreigners at all and never do. And it doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter how well you treat your partner or how well you live, or you know what you actually do and what you actually achieve. Some Japanese people just don't want foreigners in their families. You know, a guy told me once when I first came to Japan, he said, "Have you got a Japanese girlfriend?" And I said, "No." I said, "I've only been here a couple of months, and you know, I think most Japanese girls don't want foreign boyfriend." "Oh no, Japanese girls love foreigners," he said. "Japanese girls love foreigners." And I said, "Well, yeah, but you know," and "oh, you should get a Japanese wife." And I said, "Oh, but a lot of Japanese families don't want foreigners in their family." "Oh, that's not true." He said, "No, that's not true. Of course, you know, foreign in the family's fine." And I said to him, "You've got 2 daughters that are teenagers. How would you feel if one of them came home with a foreign husband, you know, 10 years from now?" And he just froze, because I'd got him. He knew how he'd feel. He wouldn't like it. And, you know, that's the thing. He's a lovely guy and we got on really well. But, you know, a foreigner in the family really complicates things in Japan. It really does, because this isn't a multicultural society. This is a homogenous society. And a foreigner in the family is a real fly in the ointment. You know, it really complicates everything for all the reasons we've talked about in the previous videos. So a lot of in-laws will just go, "Oh, foreigner, you know, don't do that," and put lots of pressure on the person not to get involved with you. Stay away from him. He's a foreigner. It's too complicated and you can't trust him and it's too messy, and you know. So it can be like that, or you can be lucky. In my case, I was really lucky, really lucky, really lucky. But it is rare. The horror stories abound, you know. So in-laws, definitely another complication to being married to a Japanese person. Anyway, something to think about there maybe. More videos coming soon.